A simple walk with a dream. Jasmine adjusted the straps of her backpack, smiling as she walked down the quiet city streets. Today, she was on her way to see her father, Captain Ethan Brooks, a man she considered her hero. 13 years old and full of dreams, Jasmine looked up to her dad in every way. As a police captain, he wasn't just a protector of the community, but also a champion of fairness and justice. She hoped to surprise him at the station with the hot chocolate she'd brought along, a small gesture to show her appreciation for the long hours he put in to keep everyone safe. The streets of their neighborhood were lined with tall, golden trees shedding their autumn leaves. Every step she took on the crunchy leaves brought a new burst of color into the air, and the cool breeze filled her with a calm sense of excitement. She inhaled deeply, savoring the crisp scent of fall. She loved days like this when everything felt right, and the world seemed to be wrapped in a warm golden glow. As she walked, Jasmine couldn't help but daydream about the future. She imagined herself as a young woman, wearing a badge just like her father, patrolling the streets to keep them safe. She had listened intently every time her father shared stories of his cases, stories of catching thieves and helping families. He had once told her, "Justice isn't just a job, Jasmine, it's a responsibility." She took those words to heart and repeated them in her mind whenever she needed courage. Today, she whispered them to herself with a smile, feeling strong and unstoppable. Her daydreams faded when she noticed a large fire truck parked at the side of the road. She knew the firefighters in the city had a reputation for being tough and fearless, and she admired them just as much as she did the police officers. After all, firefighters saved lives too, facing flames and dangers with bravery. But something felt off today. A group of firefighters stood by the truck, laughing loudly, their voices carrying down the empty street. As she approached, Jasmine tried to blend in with the shadows of the trees, hoping to pass without drawing their attention. But luck wasn't on her side. Just as she was about to cross to the other side of the street, one of the firefighters noticed her. His gaze locked onto her, and he nudged his companion, pointing in her direction with a smirk. A prickle of unease crept down her spine as their voices grew louder, and their laughter took on a mocking tone. "Hey, little girl, where are you rushing off to?" A tall, burly firefighter called out, his voice a mix of roughness and something Jasmine couldn't quite place. She hesitated, her heart thumping in her chest, but kept her head high, not wanting to show fear. "I'm going to see my dad," she replied, her voice polite but firm, just as her father had taught her. "He works nearby." "Your dad, huh?" Another firefighter chimed in, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "And who's your dad that's so important you're rushing over?" Jasmine felt a flicker of pride as she looked up at the group of men with newfound confidence. "My dad is Ethan Brooks, the police captain," she said, hoping his name would remind them to treat her with respect. Her father had a reputation for fairness and bravery, and she thought it would make a difference here. But instead of respect, her words only seemed to fuel their amusement. The firefighters exchanged glances, then burst into loud, mocking laughter. Jasmine felt her face flush as their laughter echoed down the street, each laugh like a tiny dagger chipping away at her confidence. "Oh, so you're the police captain's daughter?" One of the men sneered, stepping closer to her. His eyes glinted with a cruel amusement that made Jasmine's skin crawl. "Well, little princess, let's see if the captain's daughter can handle a bit of fun, shall we?" Jasmine's heart pounded, and her hands began to tremble. She took a step back, hoping they'd lose interest if she ignored them. But before she could turn, one of the firefighters reached for the large hose attached to the fire truck. A grin spread across his face as he aimed the nozzle toward her. "Please, don't," Jasmine said softly, her voice catching in her throat. She tried to stay calm, thinking of her father's words about courage. But it was hard to summon that courage now, as fear settled into the pit of her stomach. Ignoring her pleas, he twisted the handle, and a blast of freezing cold water shot out of the hose, hitting her with full force. The icy chill of the water seeped through her clothes, cutting straight to her skin. Jasmine staggered backward, gasping as the cold bit into her body starting to shake uncontrollably. The firefighters howled with laughter, watching her struggle as the stream of water soaked her from head to toe. She stumbled, barely able to keep her balance as the powerful spray hit her again. The world around her seemed to blur as tears filled her eyes, mixing with the freezing water running down her cheeks. "What's wrong, tough girl?" Another firefighter taunted, his voice loud and mocking. "Aren't you the captain's daughter? Shouldn't you be used to a little rough play?" Jasmine tried to shield herself with her arms, but it was useless. Every attempt to block the water only made them laugh harder. Their cruel eyes and sneering smiles seemed to bore into her, making her feel smaller and more powerless with every second. She wanted to scream, to run, to escape from this nightmare, but her legs felt like lead, frozen by the water and the weight of their mockery. Desperately, she glanced around, hoping someone might see her and come to her aid. But the street was empty, as if the whole world had turned its back on her. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat filled with a sense of betrayal and despair. Why were they doing this? She had done nothing to deserve this cruelty. "Please, stop," she whispered, barely audible over the sound of the rushing water and their laughter. Her voice cracked, and her words were swallowed by their taunts. The firefighter holding the hose stepped closer, narrowing his eyes as he kept the stream of water aimed at her. "It's just a little water, princess," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "What's there to be afraid of?" Jasmine's tears flowed freely now, her pride and confidence shattered. She had always thought of herself as strong, as someone who could carry her father's legacy with pride. But here, under the harsh laughter of these men who were supposed to protect people, she felt like nothing more than a helpless child. "Oh, look, the little police captain's daughter is crying." One of them laughed, pointing at her with a mocking grin. "Guess she's not so tough after all, huh?" Their laughter felt like knives slicing through her, each word and each taunt stripping away her dignity piece by piece. She had never felt so humiliated, so helpless. In that moment, the pride she had held for her father, the strength she had seen in him, felt like it was crumbling under the weight of their cruelty. Finally, the firefighter released the hose, letting it fall to the ground as he gave her one last scornful look. "Next time, tell your dad to keep a closer eye on you, little girl," he sneered. "Wouldn't want you getting into any more trouble." They turned away, their laughter fading as they walked back toward the fire truck, leaving Jasmine standing alone in the middle of the street. She was drenched, shivering, and heartbroken. Every part of her ached, not just from the cold, but from the humiliation and betrayal she had endured. As their voices faded into the distance, Jasmine sank to her knees, her small frame shaking with sobs. The beautiful day, the pride she had felt for her father, and the dreams of following in his footsteps, all of it seemed to slip away in that moment, leaving only a deep, aching emptiness. But even as she cried, a small spark began to flicker in her heart, a spark of anger and determination. She had always believed in justice, in the principles her father stood for, and now, as she knelt on the wet pavement, she made a promise to herself. This wasn't the end of her story. She would find her way back to her father, and she would tell him everything. And somehow, someway, she would make sure that those who hurt her would be held accountable. Jasmine slowly rose, her body still trembling, but her eyes filled with a new sense of purpose, seeking shelter in shadows. Jasmine's steps were heavy as she walked, her drenched clothes clinging to her like an icy second skin. Her mind replayed the mocking voices, the laughter, and the piercing cold of the water that had soaked through her bones. The weight of humiliation pressed down on her with every step, and she felt like each one would be her last. She wanted to stop, to sink down on the sidewalk, and let herself be swallowed by her grief and shame. But something stronger, a tiny, fierce determination deep within, urged her forward. She had to reach her father. She had to tell him. As the familiar silhouette of the police station came into view, Jasmine quickened her pace, her heartbeat loud in her ears. The building, with its sturdy brick walls and glowing lights, had always felt like a place of safety, a symbol of strength. She had often visited her dad here after school, watching him from afar as he worked, observing how he commanded respect from his colleagues and handled everything with a calm authority that had always filled her with pride. But today, it felt like she was entering that space as a stranger, her sense of security shattered. The automatic doors slid open as she entered the station, leaving a trail of water on the polished floor. The warm air inside wrapped around her like a blanket, but it did little to shake off the cold seeping through her. The officers milling around looked up, their faces shifting from casual conversation to expressions of shock and concern as they noticed her soaked clothes, trembling hands, and tear-streaked face. "Jasmine." A familiar voice broke through the silence, and Officer Ryan, one of her father's closest friends, rushed over. His face was a mixture of concern and confusion. "What happened to you? Are you okay?" Jasmine tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She had been brave on the way here, but now, standing in front of someone who cared, the reality of what she'd endured crashed over her. Tears began to well up again, and her lips trembled as she struggled to hold them back. She felt ashamed, vulnerable, and utterly exhausted. Ryan knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Hey, it's okay. You're safe now. Let's get you to your dad. He'll know what to do." Nodding, Jasmine followed him down the long corridor to her father's office. With every step, her resolve wavered, but she focused on the image of her dad, strong, kind, and her protector. She needed to see him, needed to hear his voice reassure her that everything would be okay. When they reached the door to his office, Ryan gave a gentle knock. "Captain Ethan, you have a visitor." Inside, Ethan Brooks sat behind his desk, his head bent over a stack of paperwork. The room was warmly lit, casting a soft glow over his face, and when he looked up, his tired expression instantly shifted to surprise and alarm. He shot up from his chair, his face tightening with concern as he took in Jasmine's disheveled state. "Jasmine," he said, crossing the room to her in a few quick strides. His eyes scanned her, taking in her soaked clothes, her red-rimmed eyes, and the look of utter despair on her face. "Sweetheart, what happened? Why are you?" Jasmine couldn't hold it in any longer. She collapsed into her father's arms, her body racked with sobs as she clung to him, burying her face in his shoulder. Ethan held her tightly, his strong arms forming a protective cocoon around her. She felt the warmth of his embrace, his hand gently stroking her hair as he whispered calming words, his voice steady and filled with love. "It's okay, Jasmine. I'm here. Whatever happened, you're safe now," he murmured, though his own heart ached at the sight of his daughter in such distress. As her tears began to subside, Jasmine found the strength to speak. Her voice was barely a whisper, choked with emotion. "Dad, they sprayed me with water. They laughed at me. They said things." Ethan's jaw tightened, his expression hardening as he listened. He gently guided her to sit in the chair across from his desk and knelt down in front of her, his hands resting on her shoulders. "Who did this to you, Jasmine?" "It was the firefighters," she replied, her voice trembling. "I was just walking, and they stopped me. They made fun of you, too. They said I wasn't strong, that I was just a scared little girl." The anger simmering in Ethan's eyes was unmistakable. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check, but Jasmine could see the intensity in his gaze. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from every ounce of pain she had endured, but he knew he couldn't simply erase what had happened. All he could do now was stand by her and ensure that those responsible would be held accountable. "Jasmine, listen to me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "None of what they said is true. You are brave. You are strong. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small because of who you are." Jasmine nodded, her tears slowing, though the hurt lingered. She trusted her father's words, but the memory of the firefighters' cruelty weighed heavily on her heart. The images replayed in her mind: their sneering faces, the freezing water, the mocking laughter. No matter how much she wanted to forget, it was etched into her memory like a scar. Seeing her pain, Ethan's anger grew, but he knew he needed to channel it carefully. He couldn't afford to let his emotions cloud his judgment, especially if he wanted to get justice for Jasmine. He had faced countless difficult situations in his career, but this felt different. This was personal, and every instinct he had as a father screamed at him to confront those men and make them answer for what they'd done. But he knew better than to act impulsively. As a police captain, he understood the weight of authority, the delicate balance of power between city departments, and the possible repercussions of confronting a group of firefighters. If he wasn't careful, this could escalate into something far more complicated. Taking another deep breath, Ethan looked into Jasmine's eyes. "I promise you, Jasmine, this won't go unpunished. I'll make sure they're held accountable for what they did to you." A faint glimmer of hope sparked in Jasmine's gaze, and she gave a small nod, her trust in her father unwavering. The pain hadn't disappeared, but she felt a little lighter, knowing her dad was on her side, ready to fight for her. Ethan called Ryan into the office and explained the situation briefly, keeping his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. Ryan listened, his face growing dark with anger as he absorbed what Jasmine had gone through. "Those men," Ryan muttered, clenching his fists. "They have no right to treat anyone like that, especially a kid. Captain, you know I'm with you, whatever you decide." Ethan gave him a grateful nod. "Thanks, Ryan. We'll need to approach this carefully. I don't want anyone getting hurt, especially Jasmine. But they can't just walk away from this. They need to face the consequences." Together, they began to outline the first steps of an investigation, listing any potential witnesses and preparing to document Jasmine's account. The goal wasn't just to confront the firefighters, but to gather solid evidence so they could take formal action. Ethan was determined to approach this professionally, even though every fiber of his being wanted to march down to the fire station and confront them right then and there. As Ryan left to make a few calls, Ethan turned back to Jasmine, who sat quietly, watching her father with a newfound sense of respect and admiration. Despite her ordeal, she felt a flicker of pride in her heart. Her dad wasn't just fighting for her. He was standing up for justice, something she had always believed in. Ethan crouched down beside her again, his voice soft but resolute. "I know this has been one of the hardest things you've ever gone through. But you're not alone, Jasmine. I'll be with you every step of the way. And we're going to get through this together." Jasmine reached out, taking his hand in hers. For the first time since the incident, she felt a small measure of comfort and strength. The memory of the firefighters' taunts still lingered, but now, with her father by her side, she felt a glimmer of courage growing within her. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, squeezing his hand. Ethan pulled her into a hug, holding her close as he whispered, "I love you, Jasmine, and I'm proud of you for standing strong." In that quiet moment, Jasmine found a sense of peace amidst the turmoil. She knew that there would be challenges ahead, that the road to justice would not be easy, but she was no longer afraid. She had her father's unwavering support, and that was enough. As they sat together, a fierce determination ignited in Ethan's heart. He would stop at nothing to protect his daughter, to show her that the world could still be fair and just. He knew the battle wouldn't be easy, but for Jasmine's sake, he was ready to fight, to ensure that those who had hurt her would answer for their actions. This wasn't just about justice, it was about restoring Jasmine's sense of safety, dignity, and trust. The firefighters' retaliation. Captain Ethan Brooks stood in his office long after Jasmine had left to change into dry clothes and rest. He had reassured her with all his strength, promising that justice would be served, but he knew this would be no simple task. His own heart was a battlefield of emotions, a father's protective rage mixed with the disciplined calm of a police captain who understood the importance of patience and careful planning. Confronting a group of city firefighters, a team that, like the police, held power, status, and loyalty within the community, was a decision that could ripple far beyond this one incident. As he considered his options, a fierce resolve grew within him. These men weren't just bullies. They were supposed to be protectors. They had taken an oath to safeguard the public, and instead, they had used their position to humiliate and intimidate a child. A sharp sense of betrayal cut through him, amplifying his resolve. He had always viewed the firefighters as allies, fellow guardians of the community. This betrayal wasn't just a personal attack on Jasmine or himself. It was an insult to the values they were all sworn to uphold. By morning, Ethan's plan had taken shape. He would approach the fire station directly, determined to find answers. He'd initially tried diplomacy, speaking with their captain and giving these men the chance to acknowledge their wrongdoing. But if they refused or dismissed him, he wouldn't hesitate to pursue more serious actions. He was ready for whatever response he might receive. As he arrived at the fire station, he paused to gather himself, the cool morning air biting against his skin. He straightened his uniform, steeling himself for the confrontation ahead. With each step towards the firehouse, his resolve hardened. He would show them he wasn't just a concerned father. He was a police captain, and he would not be intimidated. Inside, the fire station was bustling, but his entrance silenced the room. The firefighters stopped what they were doing, their laughter and conversation fading into an uneasy silence as they saw who had entered. Ethan's sharp gaze scanned the room, and he quickly identified the men Jasmine had described, the ones who had tormented her. He recognized their leader, a tall, muscular man with a face set in a smug smirk, who met Ethan's gaze without a hint of remorse. It was clear they weren't surprised to see him. The tall firefighter, Mitch, if Ethan recalled correctly, stepped forward, his face twisted in a mocking grin. "Captain Brooks," he drawled, crossing his arms over his chest. "To what do we owe the pleasure?" The sarcasm in Mitch's tone stung, but Ethan held his ground, meeting the man's gaze with a cold, unwavering stare. "I'm here to talk about my daughter," he replied, his voice low and steady. "The young girl you and your friends harassed yesterday. I want to hear your side of the story." Mitch shrugged, glancing at his colleagues with a smirk. "Oh, that. Just a bit of harmless fun. Kids these days need to learn to toughen up. You should know that, Captain." The casual dismissal hit Ethan like a blow, but he refused to react. "Harmless fun," he repeated, his voice steely. "You humiliated a young girl, a 13-year-old. You made her feel unsafe and degraded. Do you call that harmless?" Mitch shrugged again, his smirk unwavering. "She's the police captain's daughter, right? Figured she'd be made of stronger stuff." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low, mocking tone. "Maybe you need to teach her a bit about resilience." Ethan's fists clenched, his jaw tight, as he fought to keep his emotions in check. He was a trained officer, and he knew better than to let himself be provoked. But the blatant disrespect in Mitch's words and demeanor was hard to ignore. Taking a steadying breath, he fixed Mitch with a glare that left no room for doubt about his seriousness. "Let's be clear about one thing," Ethan said, his voice as cold as steel. "You abused your position as firefighters, public servants, to terrorize an innocent child. I came here to give you the chance to take responsibility for what you did, but if you refuse to acknowledge your actions, I won't hesitate to take this further. This isn't just about my daughter. It's about the trust this community places in us. Both the police and the fire department are here to protect, not harm." Mitch's smirk faded slightly, but he quickly covered it with a scoff, crossing his arms defiantly. "Take it further, huh? And what are you gonna do, Captain? File a complaint? Take us to court?" He sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You think anyone's gonna side with you over us? Firefighters are the heroes around here. People love us. They're not gonna believe some overreacting cop and his bratty kid." Ethan's resolve solidified even more at Mitch's words. These men weren't just dismissive. They were confident, brazen in their abuse, knowing that their status would protect them. Mitch's defiance was a clear signal. He had no intention of apologizing or making amends. In his mind, he and his fellow firefighters were untouchable. Ethan was about to respond when Mitch signaled to his colleagues. With a dark look, the other firefighters shifted their positions, slowly encircling him. The air in the room grew tense as Ethan found himself surrounded, his every instinct screaming that this was about to escalate. One of the firefighters leaned in close, his voice a low growl. "You don't belong here, Captain. This is our house. Don't think you can just waltz in here and throw your weight around." Ethan held his ground, his jaw clenched as he looked each of them in the eye. "I came here peacefully, asking for an explanation. But if this is how you want to handle it..." Before he could finish, Mitch gave a signal, and the group closed in, shoving him backward. Ethan stumbled, quickly regaining his footing, but he was clearly outnumbered. They advanced, their faces twisted with scorn and malice, clearly enjoying the power they held over him in this moment. Another firefighter shoved him from behind, and Ethan staggered forward, catching himself just in time. He tried to steady himself, but they were relentless, pushing and prodding, their sneers and mocking laughter filling the room. The sight of these men, public servants, behaving like school-eared bullies made Ethan's stomach churn with disgust. "You think you're so tough, don't you?" Mitch taunted, his face inches from Ethan's. "Coming in here, telling us how to do our job. Well, here's a lesson for you, Captain. You're not the boss here." A hard shove to his shoulder sent Ethan sprawling to the ground. He gritted his teeth, fighting the urge to retaliate, knowing that any reaction could be used against him. But as he lay on the cold floor, the humiliation and frustration boiling within him, he couldn't help but think of Jasmine, of the pain and fear she must have felt in this very position. The firefighters closed in, their taunts turning into sharp, mocking jabs. "Where's the big tough captain now? Ha!" One sneered, landing a sharp kick to his side. Ethan felt the pain radiate through him, but he refused to let them see his weakness. Each punch and kick felt like a betrayal, not just to him, but to the uniform he wore and the values he upheld. These men were supposed to be heroes, defenders of the community, yet here they were, showing their true colors in the ugliest way imaginable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mitch signaled for them to stop. He crouched down beside Ethan, his face twisted in a sneer. "Consider this a warning, Captain. Stick your nose in our business again. And next time, we won't be so gentle." With that, they stepped back, leaving Ethan lying on the floor, bruised and battered. As they walked away, he struggled to push himself up, every muscle in his body protesting in pain. But the fire inside him was stronger than the pain, and he slowly got to his feet, his gaze fixed on Mitch with a fierce, unwavering determination. He would not let them get away with this. No matter how untouchable they thought they were, he would find a way to hold them accountable. For Jasmine, for every innocent person who relied on public servants to protect, not terrorize. Ethan stumbled out of the fire station, leaning against the wall to catch his breath. Every step he took was agony, but his resolve only grew stronger. He would go back to the police station, gather his team, and start the investigation. There was no turning back now. His daughter's dignity, his own honor, and the community's trust were at stake. As he limped down the street, bruised and battered but unbroken, he knew this battle was only beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and opposition, but Ethan was ready. He would fight, not just for himself and Jasmine, but for the justice they both deserved. The community rallies. Captain Ethan Brooks sat quietly in his office, his body aching from the bruises that littered his skin. The confrontation with the firefighters had left him physically beaten, but his spirit remained unyielding. He looked down at his hands, the knuckles scraped and swollen, a reminder of the brutal lesson Mitch and his men had tried to teach him. But the pain only fueled his determination. This wasn't just about his daughter anymore. It was about the values he'd spent his entire career defending. It was about standing up to those who believed their power placed them above accountability. As he prepared himself for the long battle ahead, a knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Officer Ryan and a few other officers entering, their expressions tense and concerned. Word of his encounter with the firefighters had already spread through the precinct, and the officers who knew Ethan well could see that this was no ordinary matter. Ryan was the first to speak, his voice filled with a quiet, controlled anger. "Captain, I heard what happened at the fire station. What they did to you and Jasmine. It's beyond unacceptable. We can't let them get away with this." Ethan nodded, the pain still etched into his face, but his gaze was resolute. "This isn't just about what happened to me or Jasmine. Those men used their authority to intimidate and hurt someone defenseless. They don't deserve the badges they wear, and I'm not letting this slide. I've already started gathering evidence, and I intend to see this through to the end." The officers exchanged glances, nodding in agreement. "We're with you, Captain," Ryan said firmly. "Whatever you need, we're here to help." Ethan felt a swell of gratitude. He knew the risks involved. Going after the firefighters could easily lead to a backlash from the fire department and could tarnish his own reputation if things went wrong. But knowing he had the support of his fellow officers strengthened his resolve. They were ready to stand with him, even if it meant challenging another powerful department. Later that day, as Ethan reviewed the preliminary reports and statements from Jasmine, he received a surprising call. Mrs. Collins, their longtime neighbor and family friend, had heard about what happened. She spoke in a voice thick with emotion, but beneath it was a fiery determination. "Ethan," she said, "this whole neighborhood is outraged. Jasmine is like a daughter to all of us, and what those men did is unforgivable. I've spoken to a few other parents and community leaders. We want to help. The city needs to know what happened. We're going to make sure they listen." Moved by her words, Ethan tried to thank her, but Mrs. Collins waved him off. "No, Ethan, this is what community is about. We protect each other. You're not alone in this fight." Over the next few days, Mrs. Collins and other neighbors began organizing a rally to demand justice for Jasmine and Ethan. They spread the word through social media, posting about the incident and calling for support. It wasn't long before the story reached a larger audience, drawing attention from neighboring communities and beyond. People shared their outrage on social media, calling for accountability and condemning the abuse of power. But the story took on a life of its own when a young teenager who had been passing by the fire station the day of Ethan's confrontation came forward. He had witnessed the entire incident and had recorded it on his phone. The video, which showed Ethan being surrounded, mocked, and assaulted by the firefighters, quickly went viral after he posted it with a caption, "This is what happens when a police captain tries to stand up for his daughter. Is this justice?" The video spread like wildfire, sparking national attention and drawing a flood of comments and messages. People were horrified by the firefighters' actions, especially towards someone who was simply seeking justice for his daughter. Soon, hashtags like #JusticeForJasmine and #StandWithEthan began trending across social media platforms, with people from all walks of life expressing their outrage and support. As the video continued to circulate, human rights organizations and child advocacy groups began to get involved. Statements were released, condemning the abuse of power displayed in the video and calling for an independent investigation. Prominent public figures and activists voiced their support, amplifying the call for justice. The public pressure reached a boiling point when a large group of community members gathered in front of the fire station one crisp morning. Mrs. Collins, along with Jasmine's teachers, neighbors, and dozens of concerned residents, held up signs demanding accountability. Signs reading "Justice for Jasmine" and "No room for abuse of power" dotted the crowd. Local news stations were quick to cover the protest, and reporters flocked to the scene, interviewing the community members about the incident. One reporter approached Mrs. Collins, who stood at the forefront of the group, her face set with resolve. "Why are you here today?" the reporter asked, holding a microphone toward her. Mrs. Collins didn't hesitate. "We're here because a young girl was bullied and humiliated by the very people who are supposed to protect her," she said, her voice strong and unwavering. "We're here because her father, a man who has dedicated his life to justice, was attacked for simply trying to defend his daughter. This isn't just about one family. It's about the safety of our community and holding those in power accountable. We will not stay silent." Her words were met with applause and cheers from the crowd, and the protest grew louder as people chanted for justice. As the news coverage spread, more people joined the rally, and support for Jasmine and Ethan surged. Donations poured in to support their legal battle, and local businesses displayed signs in solidarity with the Brooks family. Inside the police station, Ethan watched the news coverage with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. He had expected the investigation to be difficult, to face obstacles from those who wanted to protect their own. But the sheer power of the community's support filled him with renewed strength. He looked over at Jasmine, who had joined him at the station for the day. She was watching the news too, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and hope. "Dad," she whispered, her voice full of wonder. They're doing all of this for us." Ethan knelt down beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "Yes, sweetheart, because you're not alone. The whole community stands with you, and that's something no one can take away." Jasmine's eyes sparkled with a new sense of confidence. The scars from her experience remained, but she was beginning to realize that her story had the power to make a difference. The pain she had endured was real, but it had ignited a movement for justice that had resonated far beyond her own life. As the pressure mounted, the city council could no longer ignore the outcry. They convened an emergency meeting to discuss the incident, facing mounting calls for a formal investigation. The council members knew that this was a situation that could not be brushed aside or swept under the rug. The community's anger was too strong, the evidence too damning. At the police station, Ethan was preparing to meet with the city's legal representatives when his phone buzzed. It was a message from Mrs. Collins, with a video attached. The video was from the rally, and as he watched, Ethan's eyes filled with emotion. The video showed the crowd chanting, holding signs, and calling for justice. They were chanting Jasmine's name, their voices rising in unison, their support unwavering. He felt a lump form in his throat as he listened. The voices of the community, the voices of those who cared for his daughter, who believed in him, echoed through the room. In that moment, Ethan knew that whatever happened next, he would never have to face it alone. The community had become a shield around his family, a barrier of love and support that no amount of intimidation could break. The following morning, Ethan and Jasmine were met by a swarm of reporters outside the police station. Ethan took a deep breath, guiding Jasmine forward. She looked up at him, her face a mixture of nerves and determination. With a gentle nod, he encouraged her to speak. The cameras turned to her, and she took a shaky breath before speaking, her voice soft but steady. "I just want to say thank you," she began, her eyes scanning the crowd, filled with supporters and strangers alike. "Thank you for standing up for me and my dad. It means everything to us. I was scared, and I felt so alone. But knowing that all of you are here with us, it makes me feel safe again." Her words were met with applause and cheers from the crowd, and for the first time since the incident, Jasmine smiled, a real, genuine smile filled with hope. Ethan placed a comforting arm around her, his own heart swelling with pride. This wasn't just a battle for justice anymore. It was a fight for the soul of their community, a stand against abuse, and a testament to the strength that could be found in unity. As they walked back into the station, Ethan knew that the road ahead would still be long and filled with challenges. The firefighters wouldn't go down without a fight, and the legal proceedings would be intense. But with the community rallying around them, with people who believed in justice standing by their side, he knew they would endure. The community's voices had become a force stronger than any threat, louder than any intimidation. Together, they were unstoppable. A battle in court. The courtroom was filled to capacity. The air inside was tense, thick with anticipation and murmurs as people took their seats. The Brooks family sat in the front row, with Ethan and Jasmine surrounded by officers, friends, neighbors, and supporters. Jasmine's hand rested in her father's, her fingers clasped tightly around his. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but with her father's steady presence by her side, and the community filling the rows behind her, she knew she was not alone. This was the day Jasmine had been waiting for since that traumatic encounter with the firefighters, but the reality of sitting in court, prepared to share her story before a judge, lawyers, and spectators, made her heart race. She looked up at her father, and he gave her a reassuring nod, his expression filled with a fierce determination. He had fought tirelessly to reach this point, and now, surrounded by the support of the community, he was ready to ensure that justice would be served. The media had swarmed the courthouse steps that morning, capturing the scene as Jasmine, Ethan, and their supporters arrived. The news of the case had spread far and wide, turning the trial into a national headline. It wasn't just a case about a young girl's trauma anymore. It had become a symbolic fight for justice against the abuse of power, a battle that resonated with countless people across the country. As the judge entered, a hush fell over the courtroom. The judge, a woman known for her fairness and no-nonsense approach, took her seat, her gaze sweeping over the room before landing briefly on Jasmine. Ethan noticed the flicker of empathy in her eyes, and it gave him hope. She was someone who would listen, who wouldn't be swayed by the titles and uniforms of the firefighters on trial. The lead defense attorney, representing Mitch and the firefighters involved, was a seasoned lawyer known for his aggressive style. His clients had the backing of the fire department and the support of powerful allies who didn't want their image tarnished. They had pulled out all the stops, hiring the best defense team money could buy, hoping to twist the narrative and discredit Jasmine and Ethan's account. The proceedings began with the prosecution laying out the details of the case. They presented Jasmine's story, describing the humiliation, fear, and lasting trauma she had endured. They outlined Ethan's confrontation with the firefighters, the brutal assault he had suffered, and the mockery they had made of his position and family. Every detail was designed to show the court the depth of the injustice that Jasmine and Ethan had faced. The first witness was Jasmine herself. She took a deep breath as she approached the stand, her small frame dwarfed by the imposing witness chair. The courtroom fell silent, every eye trained on her as she sat down, clutching a small stuffed animal hidden in her pocket for comfort. The prosecutor approached her gently, guiding her through her testimony with sensitivity and care. "Jasmine," he began, his tone soft and encouraging. "Can you tell us in your own words what happened that day?" Jasmine nodded, her voice wavering slightly as she recounted the events. She described the firefighters' mocking voices, the way they had circled her, blocking her path, and the humiliation she had felt when they sprayed her with freezing water. She spoke of their laughter, the way they made her feel small, powerless, and exposed. Her words hung heavily in the air, each sentence painting a vivid picture of the cruelty she had endured. As she spoke, Ethan felt his heart ache. Hearing his daughter recount the trauma she had suffered made his anger surge anew, but he kept his expression calm, his gaze fixed on her with unwavering support. He knew this was difficult for her, but he also knew that her bravery would make a difference. The truth she was speaking would be their weapon against the lies and manipulation they were up against. The defense attorney rose when it was his turn, his expression calculating. He approached Jasmine, his voice smooth and practiced, but laced with an underlying tone of condescension. "Jasmine," he said, smiling as though he were speaking to a much younger child, "I know this must have been a frightening experience for you. But I have to ask, do you think you may have misunderstood the situation? Sometimes people can exaggerate things, especially when they're scared." Jasmine shifted in her seat, feeling the weight of his gaze, but she kept her chin up. "No, sir," she replied, her voice steady. "They were laughing at me." They called me names, and they sprayed me with water. I didn't misunderstand. The attorney's smile tightened, but he pressed on. Are you sure, Jasmine? People make jokes sometimes, and maybe they didn't mean any harm. They're firefighters, after all. They save lives. Are you sure they meant to make you feel bad? Jasmine's small hands clenched in her lap, her voice growing stronger. Yes, they meant it. They knew what they were doing, and they laughed when I cried. I asked them to stop, but they didn't listen. Her words echoed through the courtroom, and Ethan saw several people in the audience nodding, their faces filled with sympathy and admiration for her courage. The defense attorney's expression hardened, realizing that he would get no easy concessions from Jasmine. He tried a few more questions, attempting to poke holes in her story, but Jasmine held firm, her voice unwavering as she recounted the truth. After her testimony, the courtroom erupted in quiet murmurs. The prosecutor gave Jasmine a nod of appreciation as she returned to her seat, and Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, whispering his pride in her bravery. Jasmine's testimony had left an undeniable impact on the room, and Ethan could feel the tide turning in their favor. The next witness was Ethan himself. He took the stand, his posture confident but calm. He described his visit to the fire station, the confrontation with Mitch and his men, and the brutal beating he had endured. He spoke of the mockery and taunts they had hurled at him, recounting how they had surrounded him, stripping him of any respect, and showing no regard for the law or justice. The defense attorney tried to trip him up, insinuating that he might have exaggerated or even instigated the confrontation. But Ethan remained composed, countering every question with a steady, firm reply. He wasn't just fighting for himself or his daughter. He was standing up for every person who had ever been intimidated by those in power. The defense presented their case next, attempting to paint the firefighters as well-respected men in the community who would never intentionally harm a child or disrespect a police captain. They portrayed the incident as a misunderstanding, a harmless prank that had been blown out of proportion. The defense attorney called character witnesses, fellow firefighters, and community members who spoke of Mitch and his team's bravery, their dedication to saving lives. But the prosecution was ready. They countered each witness, presenting evidence that challenged the defense's narrative. They introduced the viral video of Ethan's beating, a recording that had become a rallying cry for the community. The video showed the firefighters surrounding him, shoving and taunting him, with Mitch's sneering face clearly visible. The jury watched in silence, the tension in the room palpable as the brutality of the incident was laid bare. As the video played, a wave of anger rippled through the audience. This was no harmless prank. This was abuse of power, a flagrant disregard for the uniform and the community's trust. Ethan noticed the jurors exchanging glances, their expressions grim as they absorbed the truth of what had happened. Finally, after days of testimony, the closing arguments were delivered. The prosecution emphasized the impact of the trauma on Jasmine, the betrayal of trust, and the firefighters' flagrant disregard for the respect and honor that came with their roles. The defense, grasping at straws, attempted to discredit the video as misinterpreted and insisted that Mitch and his men were simply misunderstood. The judge gave the jury their instructions, and they filed out to deliberate. The waiting was agonizing. Hours passed, and every minute felt like an eternity. Jasmine leaned against her father, her small frame exhausted but filled with a cautious hope. Ethan held her close, his own nerves a tangled mess of fear and anticipation. Finally, the jury returned, and the room fell into a tense silence as the judge asked for the verdict. The foreman stood, his voice steady as he read the decision. "We, the jury, find the defendants guilty on all counts." A wave of relief washed over Ethan and Jasmine, and a cheer erupted from their supporters. Jasmine felt tears welling up in her eyes, a mixture of joy, relief, and gratitude. Her father hugged her tightly, his own eyes misty with emotion as he whispered, "We did it, Jasmine. justice was served. The judge sentenced Mitch and the other firefighters involved to community service, suspensions without pay, and mandatory sensitivity training. She also mandated a thorough investigation of the fire department's culture, ensuring that abuses of power would no longer go unchecked. The courtroom erupted in applause as the gavel fell, marking the end of a long and difficult battle. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, waiting for the verdict. When Jasmine and Ethan emerged, they were met with cheers and applause. Reporters rushed forward, microphones extended, but Ethan held up a hand, signaling for quiet. He looked down at Jasmine, who nodded, stepping forward to speak. "I just want to thank everyone who stood by us," Jasmine said, her voice steady, filled with a newfound strength. "This wasn't just for me. This was for everyone who has ever been hurt by people in power. I'm so grateful to have people who believed in me and my dad. Together, we proved that no one is above justice." The crowd erupted in applause again, and Ethan felt a sense of pride he couldn't put into words. This was a victory not only for their family, but for the entire community. Jasmine's courage had sparked a movement that had held the powerful accountable, proving that even the smallest voices could make a difference when united. As they walked away from the courthouse, hand in hand, Ethan looked down at Jasmine, seeing in her not just his daughter but a young woman who had faced injustice with bravery and resilience. She had stood against her fears, spoken her truth, and inspired an entire community to rally for what was right. And in that moment, Ethan knew that his daughter's future was as bright as the justice they had fought for. Solid, unbreakable, and filled with hope, justice and new beginnings. The days following the trial were filled with a strange mixture of relief, exhaustion, and a sense of hope that had once felt unreachable. For Jasmine and her father, Captain Ethan Brooks, the weight of the courtroom battle was finally behind them. Justice had been served, but the emotional journey that had brought them to this point left its own deep and lasting marks. Jasmine, though victorious, was still carrying the scars of her ordeal. She had grown stronger, more resilient, but she hadn't forgotten the fear and humiliation she had experienced. It was as if that moment had been frozen in time, a fragment of her innocence shattered by cruelty. But now, with the trial over and the community rallying around her, she began to feel a glimmer of something else. Empowerment. She had faced her fears, told her truth, and had been believed. And in doing so, she had helped to spark a change. One evening, as the golden glow of the sunset bathed their neighborhood, Ethan found Jasmine sitting on the front steps of their house, gazing thoughtfully at the horizon. Her posture was relaxed, but there was a quiet intensity in her eyes that reminded him of the courtroom, of the courage she had shown in facing down those who had tried to belittle her. He sat down beside her, placing a comforting arm around her shoulders. "You did something incredible, Jasmine," he said softly. "Not everyone has the strength to stand up and demand justice like you did." Jasmine looked up at him, her expression contemplative. "I didn't think I could at first. I was so scared. But I didn't want them to get away with it. I wanted people to know what they did wasn't right. And people did listen," Ethan replied, pride shining in his eyes. "Because you had the courage to speak up. You changed the way this community sees things, Jasmine. You helped people remember the importance of standing up against abuse, no matter who's involved." She gave a small nod, a faint smile crossing her face. "I'm glad it's over, Dad. I feel better, lighter, but it's weird. I don't think things will ever go back to how they were before." Ethan sighed, understanding exactly what she meant. The experiences they had endured had changed them both. It was a sobering reality, but one he had come to accept. "Things won't ever be the same, sweetheart," he agreed. "But sometimes change can be a good thing. We're stronger now, and we've reminded this community of what real justice looks like." In the weeks following the trial, the City Council implemented reforms to address issues of accountability and abuse within both the police and fire departments. The investigation had revealed not only the shocking behavior of Mitch and his team, but also a culture of unchecked power that had, for too long, gone unnoticed. Sensitivity training, psychological evaluations, and stricter standards were enforced for all public servants in the city. It was a small victory, but one that left an impact. As these changes took place, the community continued to rally around the Brooks family. Friends and neighbors frequently stopped by to offer their support, sharing their appreciation for Jasmine's bravery. Local organizations held events honoring her, and her school awarded her a certificate of courage, commending her for her strength and resilience. Jasmine was both surprised and moved by the recognition. What had started as a nightmare had transformed into something powerful, an experience that had given her a voice and a purpose. One afternoon, Mrs. Collins, their family friend and staunch supporter, invited Jasmine to speak at a youth event about standing up against bullying and abuse. Though she was nervous, Jasmine accepted. On the day of the event, she stood on stage in front of a crowd of young faces, some of whom she recognized from her school and neighborhood. She clutched the microphone, feeling the familiar tremor of nerves, but as she looked out at the sea of expectant faces, she remembered the power of her voice. "I was afraid," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I thought that if I told people what happened, no one would believe me. I thought maybe I was too small to make a difference. But I learned that even if you're scared, you should always tell your truth, because sometimes that's all it takes to change things." The crowd erupted in applause, and Jasmine felt a swell of pride, not just in herself, but in the strength of her message. She saw in the audience young girls and boys who looked at her with admiration, faces that reflected the impact of her words. She felt as though she was passing on the torch of courage, helping others see the importance of standing up, even when it felt difficult or frightening. Her speech resonated deeply within the community, sparking more conversations about accountability and integrity. Jasmine's story became a rallying point for youth groups, schools, and organizations across the city, inspiring countless others to share their own experiences and stand up against injustice. She had become a voice for those who had been silenced, a symbol of resilience and bravery. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his work at the police station with a renewed sense of purpose. The trial had been a reminder to him, too, of the importance of upholding justice within his own ranks. He became more vigilant, more attuned to the needs of the community, and more dedicated than ever to ensuring that the officers under his command embodied the values they were sworn to protect. He implemented open-door policies, inviting community members to come forward with concerns or complaints, determined to rebuild the trust that had been damaged by the actions of the firefighters. The changes within the police department were slow but meaningful. Ethan's leadership inspired other officers to take a closer look at their own actions and to challenge any behavior that went against the principles of justice and fairness. It wasn't an easy path, but with each small step, Ethan felt he was honoring the promises he had made to Jasmine and the community. As the months passed, Jasmine began to settle into a new sense of normalcy. The pain and fear of that day still lingered, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it became a source of strength, a reminder of her resilience. She continued to speak at events, sharing her story and encouraging others to find their voices. She knew that her journey was far from over, but she was no longer afraid. She had transformed her trauma into purpose, and she carried that purpose with pride. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, Jasmine and Ethan took a walk together. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, and the sounds of children playing echoed down the street. It was a peaceful, ordinary evening, yet to them, it felt extraordinary. Jasmine looked up at her father, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Dad, do you think things will ever really be just like everywhere?" Ethan paused, considering her question. "I think justice is something we have to fight for, Jasmine. It doesn't just happen on its own. It takes people who are willing to stand up, like you did. It takes people who won't look the other way when they see something wrong." She nodded slowly, absorbing his words. "Then I guess we just have to keep standing up, right?" "Exactly," he replied, smiling down at her. "And as long as we keep doing that, we're making a difference, even if it's just a little bit at a time." They continued walking in silence, a shared understanding between them. Jasmine felt a sense of peace settle over her, a contentment she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew that life would bring more challenges, more moments that would test her courage, but she also knew that she had the strength to face them. She had learned that true justice wasn't about being fearless. It was about having the courage to act in spite of fear. As they reached their front steps, Jasmine paused, glancing back at the quiet street that had once felt like a place of pain, but now held a new sense of belonging and community. She took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of her father's hand on her shoulder, and she smiled. "Thanks, Dad," she said, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "For what?" he asked, his own voice choked with emotion. "For standing by me, for believing in me, and for teaching me what it means to be brave." Ethan wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "You taught me too, Jasmine. You reminded me why I chose this path. You reminded me that sometimes the smallest voices can make the biggest difference." Together, they stood there, watching as the last rays of sunlight faded into the horizon, a symbol of both an ending and a new beginning. They had faced darkness, endured hardship, and emerged stronger, united by a shared commitment to justice and an unbreakable bond of love. As they turned and entered their home, they carried with them the promise of a brighter future, a future where courage, truth, and resilience would light the way forward.